Obviously, when people think of adaptations of J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy stories, they think of the movies directed by Peter Jackson. However, there have been other filmmakers who've attempted to bring The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit to the screen, usually in animation. Most notably, Walt Disney considered getting the rights to adapt the world of Middle-earth in animation. However, it was felt the stories were too complex, and even if Disney tried, Tolkien would never let him have the rights because he hated Snow White and the studio's other adaptations. In fact, Tolkien was insistent to his publishers to never sell the film rights to Disney. In the 1960s, he sold the rights to The Hobbit to producer William Snyder, the head of Rembrandt Films, which made animated shorts with Gene Deitch. The original plan was to make a feature film, but at some point the clock began ticking as the rights were set to expire. Snyder asked Deitch to quickly make a 12-minute short instead. He got people off the street in New York to watch the finished film in a small screening room, and that was enough to retain the rights. Although referring to this short as animated is a bit of a stretch, as it just consists of a series of drawings with barely any animation. It's also almost nothing like the story that people would be familiar with. Oh, there's a hobbit named Bilbo, and a wizard named Gandalf, and a dragon, and other little things, but it feels like hearing someone who quickly glanced at the back of the book trying to summarize the story from memory. For example, instead of a bunch of dwarfs, there's a princess that comes along with Bilbo, Gandalf, and Thorin Oakenshield on the adventure. And Gollum is in it, but the narrator pronounces his name Gloom. The whole thing is kind of fascinating, honestly, and judging the short on its own, and not as an adaptation of The Hobbit, there is a certain charm. The drawings do show a lot of creativity, and Herb Ross provides a nice narration. As you'll see, filmmakers tend to interpret Gollum their own way, and his design here kind of looks like he would fit right in at Monsters, Inc. This short makes for quite the curiosity, both for its backstory and the finished result. The rights would eventually return to Tolkien, and he would listen to a few more proposals, with United Artists deciding to give Lord of the Rings a try. Tolkien would remain skeptical anything would come out of it, though. Probably the most infamous pitch was a version that would have starred the Beatles, with Stanley Kubrick being courted to direct. But Kubrick felt Lord of the Rings was unfilmable. Eventually, Rankin-Bass took it upon themselves to adapt The Hobbit into an animated made-for-television movie, which aired on NBC. According to Arthur Rankin Jr., The Hobbit was in the public domain in the United States at the time, and that allowed them to legally produce the adaptation, although they had to obtain certain rights to get the special to air in countries where the story was still under copyright. Within its 78 minutes, it rushes through the story, hitting the necessary bullet points, but manages to attain a certain charm and likability in its presentation. The animation for the special is done by a studio in Japan named Topcraft, which would later animate Hayao Miyazaki's Nausicaa the Valley of the Wind, and became a precursor to Studio Ghibli. There is a pleasing look to the movie and its depiction of Middle-earth, particularly the lovingly drawn locations. The voices especially added a lot to the characters, with Orson Bean being a particularly good fit for Bilbo. John Huston is also excellent as Gandalf, with his voice commanding the needed respect. The highlight of the movie is the Riddles in the Dark sequence. Gollum is depicted almost like a frogman here, but it works and shows how much he's been affected by the power of the ring, although I was surprised at the designs of the elves. Maybe I'm so used to what they look like in Peter Jackson's adaptations, but they look like goblins to me here, even though they're actual goblins elsewhere in the movie. Meanwhile, while Thorin is given a fair amount of attention, being the lead dwarf, the other dwarfs are mostly in the background. I'm personally not crazy about the music. Actually, for the longest time, I assumed Leonard Nimoy's The Ballad of Bilbo Baggins was from this movie. It was instead written 10 years earlier and does not feature in this movie, but it would have been an appropriate choice for the soundtrack. Overall, I thought this did a commendable job of telling the story of The Hobbit, as truncated as it was. Around the time Rankin-Bass was working on this, Ralph Bakshi was working his adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, being a longtime fan of Tolkien. With how massive the story was, the plan was to release it in two parts, with the first movie consisting of The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers. I think Bakshi brought the needed epic feel to the film, and showing the constant danger Frodo Baggins and the rest of the Fellowship get into as they head off to destroy the One Ring. The characters have their distinct qualities that make them stand out, including the leadership, guidance, and occasional harshness exhibited by Gandalf, the intensity of Aragorn, and the bravery of Frodo. Well, there is one character the film chose to take in a bizarre direction, and that was Sam. Bakshi and the writers decided to turn him into a bumbling comic relief, and he just comes across as whiny and annoying. I guess with everyone else being depicted in a mostly serious manner, Bakshi felt the need to have a character provide some levity, and Sam lost out. One of the main things that stands out about the film is Bakshi's decision to use rotoscoping. This made it easier for the big battle sequences to be depicted, and overall the rotoscoping technique does work for the most part, although there are times when it just looks like they put a filter over some of the background characters. While the majority of the movie used this style, there was some traditional animation in a few spots. In fact, quite a few notable names worked on the animation and helped out with the rotoscoping. Renowned Disney animator Dale Baer worked on the movie, as did Phil Roman, the founder of the animation studio Film Roman. Marvel Comics artist Mike Ploog, who held several jobs on Lord of the Rings, even revealed he worked across from Tim Burton, who worked on the rotoscoping, although Burton was left uncredited. I also really like the score, with Linda Roseman writing an appropriately whimsical theme for the Hobbits, but also bringing the required seriousness to the battle scenes, although Bakshi himself would later grow to dislike the score. Ralph Bakshi does get into the sense of adventure and heart of the story, and he does not flinch in depicting the battles. When the swords slash through orcs, you feel the impact. And he does several neat visual tricks to highlight the given mood and danger of a scene. I do think the Fellowship of the Ring portion is stronger and better paced than the Two Towers section, but I still think there are plenty of good things in the second half. As mentioned, the plan was to make 2 films, and Bakshi wanted to even title the film The Lord of the Rings Part 1, but United Artists was concerned nobody would pay to see half a movie. If only they could see Hollywood now. The movie did perform decently at the box office, but there are conflicting reasons for why Bakshi did not direct Return of the King. Instead, Rankin-Bass will return to Middle-earth and direct their own adaptation of the book. Contrary to popular belief, they did not choose to make Return of the King to finish off what Bakshi started. In fact, they started work on their movie before The Lord of the Rings was even released. Saul Sands, who produced the film, even tried to block the Rankin-Bass film from airing. However, a deal was worked out, and The Return of the King was able to premiere on ABC in 1980. I actually did see this not long after I saw the Peter Jackson adaptation, but it did not really stick with me. Watching the film again, it's okay, although it makes a lot of odd decisions. For one thing, it begins with Frodo already being taken by the orcs after his confrontation with Shelob the Spider. Strange place to start the story, and as a result, we spend a considerable amount of time with Sam, who's depicted as brave and willing to save Frodo. But it's surprising how much the film devotes to this. Frodo barely gets any characterization, so it does not feel as dramatic when we see he's finally succumbed to the ring's power. Meanwhile, there are a lot of songs in this. Too many in my opinion. The orcs even get a disco number. Curiously, the orcs are depicted as being reluctant participants in this war. It's a shame that Saruman and Sauron did not let them pursue their real passion, which is apparently starting a disco club. There is another song that keeps reminding us that Frodo has 9 fingers after Gollum bit one of them off. Despite these flaws, Rankin-Bass and the artists at Topcraft still put a lot of thought into the end of this saga, despite not depicting what came before outside the opening titles, showing Gandalf entrusting Frodo with the ring and the start of Frodo and Sam's journey. Watching that did make me wonder how Rankin-Bass would have adapted the first 2 books in the trilogy. Moments like the destruction of the ring and a few battle sequences still leave an impact though. Rankin himself did not view this movie favorably, feeling it was a mistake to jump straight to Return of the King rather than tell the whole story. Although I'm not sure how Ralph Bakshi would have felt about that, considering his negative view of the Rankin-Bass productions and them being made at around the same time as his. In an interesting twist, Warner Brothers would acquire the rights to Rankin-Bass's post-1974 library and several of the movies produced by Saul Sands. Thus, they now handle distribution of all 3 of these movies and have paired them together on DVD, which has probably further led to the perception that the Rankin-Bass and Ralph Bakshi films are related. Of course, years after these animated projects, Peter Jackson was given the opportunity to adapt Tolkien's books, producing 2 trilogies of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. However, it seems Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema are not done yet in bringing Tolkien's world to the screen. They sought to have Jackson come in to produce more films set in Middle-earth. To prevent the rights from expiring, they decided to produce an animated film, collaborating with Soul Animation Japan and hiring Kenji Kamiyama to direct. Titled The War of the Rohirrim, this depicted a battle several hundred years before the events of Lord of the Rings. Despite the intentions of the production, a lot of craft is still very much on display, and I was really impressed with what they put together. I mentioned this when I reviewed the film and its release, but it reminded me of 80s anime shows that involve a lot of sword fighting, and I don't mean that as a detriment. What also captivated me was how it tackled the anti-war themes and what can lead to 2 countries fighting each other. It's a theme that will remain relevant time and time again. And when the characters go into battle, we see them use the resources available to them as they plan these confrontations. While there are a few spots where the lip syncing does not quite match up and maybe the pacing could have been a little better, I still remember being enthralled watching this in the theater, and I found this to be a worthwhile expansion of the history of Middle-earth. The War of the Rohirrim unfortunately flopped at the box office, although that did not surprise me, as the marketing was not the best, and I don't think it was able to attract much of the Tolkien fanbase or people who love the Lord of the Rings trilogy. However, work is now underway on 2 new live-action Middle-earth films produced by Jackson: The Hunt for Gollum, which is being directed by Andy Serkis, and Shadow of the Past, which Stephen Colbert is co-writing the screenplay for. So the film did what Warner Brothers wanted and allowed them to retain the ability to make more entries in the franchise, just not animated ones, which is a shame. In any case, I find the animated history of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit on screen just as interesting as the live-action incarnations, and they make for fascinating interpretations of Tolkien's iconic fantasy stories. See you next time.